This year is turning out to be one of controversy among traditionalists over the question of the Pope and its relation to the disaster in the post-Vatican II Church.
First, there is the ever-increasing number of outrageous statements and gestures from Bergoglio. On one occasion recently, he claimed that John the Baptist doubted whether Christ was the Messiah. On another, he allowed himself to be invested with a clown stole. He's also planned a trip to Sweden to honor Luther and the beginning of the Protestant revolt. That's one of the Lutheran lady bishops there. Second, there's the debate sparked by True or False Pope, a book-length anti-sedevacantist screed published by the Society of St. Pius X and written by John Salza and Robert Sicoe.
Line up as follows. On one side there are sedevacantists like me. We maintain that the post-conciliar popes could not be considered true popes, for the reason that they were public heretics, who as such could not therefore validly obtain the papal office or papal authority.
The R&R position, like the Society of St. Pius X and Messrs. Salza and Sicoe. They insist one must recognize the post-conciliar popes as true popes, but nevertheless resist them by rejecting their teachings, their laws, their rights, and their commands. Since January 1st, I've put out 3 longer videos dealing with some of the general themes in the Salza-Sicoe SSPX book.
But before the next one appears, I decided to inaugurate a series of shorter videos treating some particular points in their arguments that can be handled separately. This series I call Pope Fictions, and our first installment today is entitled Nestorian Storytime. By this time, most Satan II popes were public heretics before their elections, and hence not true popes in the first place. The Sicoe-Salza SSPX book resurrected an older debate, which is therefore out of date. That is, the issue of when exactly a true pope who later becomes a public heretic would lose his office or lose his authority.
Even though I consider the issue moot, it still needs to be addressed in some fashion, because Messrs. Salza and Sicoe make it part of their attacks against sedevacantism. Here, before we get to the Nestorius story, is the heart of the dispute. By the 20th century, Catholic theologians and canonists unanimously taught that a pope who later becomes a public heretic would lose his office automatically as a matter of divine law. This position came to be adopted because of the teaching of St. Robert Bellarmine in his De Romano Pontifice.
It is ultimately rooted in a basic theological truth that no one disputes. To be a member of the Church, one must 1. Be baptized, and 2. Profess the Catholic faith. Public heresy destroys the latter condition. By divine law, you automatically lose your membership in the Church, and with it, if you are a cleric, your office or your authority. And this was the principle that sedevacantists appealed to in order to draw their conclusions about Paul VI and his successors.
The R&R camp, on the other hand, maintains that a heretical pope would not lose his office or authority automatically by divine law, but only after he was found guilty at a trial conducted by the cardinals or a council of bishops. They appeal to the writings of 3 theologians to support their position, but this broader issue we will slug out later if necessary.
What concerns us at the moment is one specific error Messrs. Salza and Sicoe make to support this argument when they appeal to the case of the 5th century heretic Nestorius, Patriarch of Constantinople.
This error appears on pages 304 to 309 of their book, and they repeat it in a recent polemical article on their site. That's my distinguished colleague, Bishop Donald Sanborn there, one of their targets. Attempting to draw an analogy to defeat the general principle behind our position, Messrs. Salza and Sicoe assert that, quote, Nestorius was not deposed by divine law the moment he began preaching heresy, but was instead deposed after the Church itself rendered a judgment. All very grand. But for further enlightenment on this point, we turn to one of the most eminent theologians of the 20th century, Louis Cardinal Billot, S.J. Billot played a role in writing St. Pius X's great anti-modernist encyclical Pascendi, and his major treatises are considered milestones in dogmatic theology. And lo and behold, in his Tractatus de Ecclesia, Billot teaches the opposite of Messrs. Salza and Sicoe.
There, the Cardinal not only confirms the simple theological truth underlying the sedevacantist position, public heresy automatically takes you out of the Church, and if you are a heretic, automatically strips you of your office or your authority. But he also specifically adduces the case of Nestorius to prove it. First, here is the general principle that Billot lays down.
To be sure, whoever dwells outside the Church is ipso facto rendered unfit for all ordinary jurisdiction, that is, episcopal jurisdiction. The reason is that a person who has ordinary jurisdiction, or truly episcopal jurisdiction, possesses the dignity of being the head. And no one can be the head of even a particular church if he is not a member of the Church. Then, as proof for the foregoing, Billot quotes a passage from the letter of Pope Celestine on the excommunications that Nestorius had pronounced against Catholics who opposed the heresiarch's errors. Because Nestorius, quote, had already called down upon himself a divine judicial sentence, unquote. The acts were not valid, quote, from the moment that Nestorius and those like him began to proclaim such heresy, unquote.
While a bishop who is a secret heretic still enjoys authority in the Church, Billot concludes, he loses his jurisdiction, quote, from the time at which he begins to preach heresy openly.
For the full quotes from Cardinal Billot, together with a lengthy and excellent refutation of Messrs. Salza and Sicoe's other errors about the Nestorius affair, see the Novus Ordo Watch site at this address. In their rambling response to the Novus Ordo Watch post, Messrs. Salza and Sicoe only got themselves in deeper by implying that Billot was wrong, and then in this passage by wrongly conflating loss of jurisdiction and excommunication. Such mistakes are perhaps forgivable in an amateur, but deadly for the Society of St. Pius X's anointed and luminous experts.
And while we're at it, I should add that since I'm not working for H&R Block on the side, Mr. Salza, a tax attorney, should spare us his theological deductions and concentrate on income tax deductions instead. Cardinal Billot, one of the most eminent theologians of the 20th century, directly contradicts Salza and Sicoe's pronouncement on the affair of Nestorius. Billot also clearly and directly affirms the principle underlying sedevacantism, that a heretic loses his jurisdiction, quote, from the time at which he begins to preach heresy openly. Catholic theology leads to common sense conclusions. Leads to common sense conclusions. In this case, the conclusion is as follows. Because of the harm he could do to the faith of his subjects, a cleric who is a public heretic automatically loses his ordinary jurisdiction. Distinctively, and that's the real point, they reject the Vatican. That's the real point. They reject the Vatican II changes, and rightly so. But the reason these changes are non-Catholic is that they come from non-Catholics. Had none because of public heresy. But is it too of public heresy? But is it too taxing to grasp this simple principle and judge accordingly? If so, look for help, as we did, to a Catholic cardinal, not to a cheesehead and his buddies, and certainly not to a tax attorney. Dead on arrival. No, I'm not referring to my current appearance. On John Salza and Robert Sicoe's anti-sedevacantist tirade, True or False Pope. 700-page book has been touted as a global and systematic refutation of every facet of the sedevacantist case. Deal of time on my hands, and I've taken that opportunity to read Mr. Salza and Mr. Sicoe's book and to analyze its arguments. And that's my conclusion. Dead on arrival. When it first appeared, I thought it would merit a series of videos that would allow me to present various aspects of the sedevacantist case. But the whole production turns out to be so fatally flawed that it is simply not worth the time or the attention. The fundamental reason is simple. Overall, the authors spend hundreds of pages trying to refute an argument that most sedevacantists have by now abandoned. Full chapter attacking me for holding a position that I have never held. The author's misrepresentation is so obvious that only inattentiveness, malice, or sheer stupidity can explain it. They base this attack on confusing some very basic theological terms. How can I possibly take their book seriously after such an egregious and epic failure? I doubt, moreover, that many R&R or SSPX adherents will actually read True or False Pope. How many people could bear to plow through 700 pages of its wooden, repetitive, polemical prose? The style is unbearable. It's like something that was written by a tax lawyer or someone who spends his whole day looking at stock prospectuses, which of course it was. And what about all the SSPX and R&R polemicists who have publicly praised it? In his short review, Father Linné felt compelled to mention that he read every page of the book. Would even all the other reviewers be able to say this honestly? Symbolic, like many books throughout history. How about this one? Karl Marx's Das Kapital. Tempted by capitalism, comrade? Solution here. Or the little red book of Chairman Mao Zedong. This was used during the Cultural Revolution to justify anything. All you had to do was pick it up and wave it in the air. To go right and to the point. Catholic theologians formulated their arguments clearly and their principles concisely. They defined their terms and they never wasted a word.
But how to deal with a book that is anything but this, and in fact is a sprawling polemical mess? It will be sufficient to limit our treatment of true or false pope to 4 points.
It's the overall structure of the book's argument, and eliminate what I consider extraneous. Second, I will demonstrate that the authors egregiously and carelessly distorted my own argument for the vacancy of the Holy See. They claim I maintain that the internal sin of heresy causes the loss of papal office, or prevents someone from becoming a true pope. It does not, and I never said that it did. Third, I will demonstrate that the authors pointlessly continue to attack an argument that all sedevacantists have by now abandoned: the loss of papal office by someone who is a true pope in the first place. None of us, as far as I know, now believes that the white cassocked conciliar heresiarchs were ever true popes in the first place. Just look at the banner for Novus Ordo Watch. Just what kind of true pope Messrs. Salza and Sicoe would want to leave us with?
Dead weight. Wait.
It gives us the overall structure of the author's argument. The authors have thrown in a lot of irrelevant material. So, we will engage in what Bergoglio and other Novus Ordo types call a process of discernment, and begin by eliminating this material up front. First to go, the bits of the author's preface where they attempt to sweep under the rug Archbishop Lefebvre's statements that supported, yes, supported sedevacantism. For the real story, watch my video Marcel Lefebvre, Sedevacantist. And unlike the authors, I actually knew the man, and I heard him say what he did. So these 2 pages can go. Second, chapters 1 and 2 on the attributes of the Church and its marks. These 2 are red herrings, intended to portray sedevacantism as untenable, even before the authors go on to misrepresent its arguments. Sedevacantism, the authors assure us, is not even worth considering, because it overthrows the attributes and the marks of the Church. But in fact, it is the recognize and resist position that the authors flog in the second part of the book that trashes these attributes and marks. More on that later. And confused treatment of membership in the Church. It is a setup for the author's chaptership in the Church. It is a setup for the author's chapter 5, which, as we shall see, refutes the argument I do not hold. For the Dimons, but irrelevant for the rest of us. And besides, most Feniites are blood brothers to Messrs. Salza, Sicoe, and SSPX anyway, because they too will accept no papal pronouncement without a solemn ex cathedra stamp on it. The 5th, episcopal consecration and the new rite of priestly ordination. These are not directly pertinent to the central issue of the book, which is, can a heretic be a true pope? Six, chapter 20. Look who's talking. I've already lobbed this one right back at Salza. Look who's talking. I've already lobbed this one right back at Salza, Sicoe, and their backers, the Society of St. Pius X, with the video SSPX and bitter fruit. No one is exempt from bitter fruits. I listed 41 from their orchard. Mind your own marmalade. The
This is useless and just plain dishonest.
Just my book on the new Mass. Messrs. Salza and Sicoe, it seems, want to put you through the trouble of picking through the footnotes to find them instead.
A complete list of what I've written. Serious inquirers might decide to read it. What I've written. Serious inquirers might decide to read it and be convinced.
Said, we can now get down to analyzing the two major faults of true or false pope. In chapter 5, the sin of heresy and the loss of office. It is here that our discussion of Messrs. Salza and Sicoe's book turns from a refutation into an autopsy.
The corpse is right there on page 149, where the authors identify what they call the major error of sedevacantism. The false idea that the sin of heresy alone causes the loss of ecclesiastical office is a principal error of sedevacantism. First, the sin of heresy is a matter of the internal form, of which God alone is the judge. Second, the sin of heresy alone does not cause the loss of office. Against divine law, the internal sin of heresy. While many quotations from leading sedevacantists could be provided, let us look at just a few from Father Anthony Cekada, one of the leading sedevacantist priests in America who has been teaching this erroneous position for many years. Messrs. Salza and Sicoe keep yammering on. Internal sin, internal sin, internal sin. How it doesn't put you outside the body of the Church. Even the pre-Vatican II theologian Monsignor Fenton is trotted out to reprove Father Cekada for his supposed error.
But Salza and Sicoe's statements are utterly and completely false. I have never maintained what they claim I have. Since I began writing about the sedevacanti issue, I have clearly maintained that it is public heresy that prevents a heretic from either becoming a true pope or from retaining the papal office.
Been a quarter century and are available everywhere. Traditionalist Infallibility in the Pope, 1991. Resisting the Pope, Sedevacantism and Frankenchurch, 2005. Bergoglio's Got Nothing to Lose, 2004. Over and over again, I say public sin of heresy, publicly heretical pope, public heretic, at least 15 times in these articles alone.
Messrs. Salza and Sicoe cite these articles, but they still ignore these clear statements of my position.
On page 151 of True or False Pope, they even quote 4 paragraphs from my article Sedevacantism Refuted as proof for their false charge. But sure enough, 2 paragraphs down in the very same article, I say clearly it is a question of a public sin against divine law.
What is the explanation? Malice? Inattentiveness? Or just plain stupidity?
I suspect it's largely the latter. On page 141, the authors offer us a list of terms and explanations relating to heresy. They provide a citation for only one of the 12 definitions. For the other 11, there's nothing. Just the say-so of Messrs. Salza and Sicoe, a tax lawyer and an investment advisor.
This in itself is fatal to any pretense of scholarship. The whole argument over sedevacantism, whether here or anywhere else, turns on precise definitions and distinctions over the nature of heresy, its culpability, its mode of expression, and the extent of its publicity. And it is Messrs. Salza and Sicoe's cluelessness about the latter two sets of distinctions that leads to their epic fail. They have confused the distinct concepts of internal heresy and occult heresy, and they continue to do so at least 70 times throughout their ensuing arguments. The first concept, internal heresy, pertains to the mode of expression for the heretical act. The second, occult heresy, pertains to how many people know about the heretical act.
Provides the proper distinctions to be applied to the sin of heresy. From his explanation, it is evident that Salza and Sicoe have jumbled two fundamental either-or categories. They've taken the concept internal heresy from one category and improperly set it up as an opposite to public heresy, which is actually in another category. But in fact, the correct opposite to public heresy is occult heresy, that is, known to no one or only a few. Here are the distinctions in schematic form. Internal, no external sign, or external sign, or external, heresy manifested by external signs, such as words, deeds, omissions, even if no one sees them. How many people heard or saw? Occult, heresy manifested to no one or to just a few. Or public, heresy openly and externally manifested before many. These are distinctions that Merkelbach clearly lays out for the sin, yes, the sin of heresy, in section 743 to 746. In the next section, 747, entitled The Sin of Heresy is Most Grave, that Merkelbach turns to the effects of heresy as an ecclesiastical crime or delict, the topic that so obsesses Messrs. Salza and Sicoe. No public judgment from church authority, they think. No, nothing. But one can indeed judge, without an ecclesiastical trial, that someone is guilty of a public sin, be it heresy or anything else, and then act on that judgment. Blasphemers, those married outside the church, members of those married outside the church, members of Masonic societies, those engaged in sinful occupations, and many others known to be in similar situations are treated as public sinners without any legal rigmarole or warnings. There's no requirement for getting into their heads and determining whether they really understood that sixth commandment, or that first commandment, or the church's marriage laws, or the prohibitions against Masonic affiliations, or that producing porn is evil, or that you gotta believe the creed after all. You draw the logical conclusion from their public behavior and you act on it. Public sin, no communion or no sacraments, no ecclesiastical burial, no sponsorship, no whatever. When it comes to public sins against the first commandment, you don't have to drag either Lady Gaga or Papa Gaga into a courtroom and put them on trial. Same boat. And in the latter case, with dissoluble marriages, no Catholic God, Luther being right on justification, and God rearranging the eternity of hell, the boat is obviously not the bark of Peter. Now, you may be a recognize and resist follower who rejects the idea that Bergoglio is indeed a formal, external public heretic. Focus on my main point here. Messrs. Salza and Sicoe utterly distorted my argument because they couldn't get even the basic terminology about heresy straight. This flaw permeates the rest of their argument in the book and is fatal to its credibility.
Thus, our coroner's verdict on true or false pope, by reason of massive failure to distinguish internal, external, occult, and public heresy, death by massive stupidity in chapter 5. That, unfortunately, though, still leaves us with a zombie.
In April 2014, Sicoe published an article entitled Bellarmine and Suarez on the Question of a Heretical Pope. Mr. Sicoe attempted to reconcile Bellarmine and Suarez's teaching on the loss of office by a pope who became a public heretic, and thus, so Mr. Sicoe thought, to refute the sedevacantist position. The problem, I pointed out in an article the following month, was that sedevacantists no longer believed that Bergoglio, Ratzinger, JP2, or the rest ever became true popes in the first place. These men were public heretics, and canonists taught that as a matter of divine law, a public heretic could not be validly elected pope.
So as the title of my response to Mr. Sicoe stated, Bergoglio and company had nothing to lose.
There was no requirement for a public judgment of crime for heresy, and the canonists, in laying down this prohibition, made no distinction whatsoever between a public material heretic and a public formal heretic, between someone like the man on the left and the man on the right.
Nor is recognition by Novus Ordites a logical fix for the problem. Recognition by heretics in the conclave and heretics in St. Peter's Square of the heretic in the balcony sounds a little circular, doesn't it? And besides, could the magic of universal pacific recognition turn someone into a true pope if he lacked one of the requirements of divine law for becoming pope?
Such as, well, baptized, male, age of reason, not insane, not a public heretic, or not a schismatic. Make Mr. Imam a true pope. A true pope. The bearded rabbi. Her Excellency, maybe. How about a toddler pontiff? Or this guy strapped into a canvas surplice. Monophysite, her astuteness, maybe. Francis's Protestant brother bishop, or the person on the right who's transitioned into being a guy. He self-identifies as a male. Could universal pacific recognition transition him into a true pope as well?
What do you think? Would you recognize them?
Stuck in a rut. Messrs. Salza and Sicoe, I said, were wasting their time refuting an argument that Sedes no longer made. But they didn't take the hint. So, smack dab in the middle of True or False Pope, we find 6 chapters, 6 through 12, nearly 250 pages on loss of office.
Why did they insist on letting this zombie argument still mindlessly stumble and lurch around the graveyard?
The reason is this. In their preface to True or False Pope, Messrs. Salza and Sicoe tell us they've spent 10 years researching the anti-sedevacantist case. Much of the earlier Sede material, of course, dealt with loss of office, so naturally the authors spent a lot of time looking up material on that issue.
But then, Messrs. Salza and Sicoe discovered that Sedes don't really hold the loss of office theory anymore. What to do? They should have eliminated the research that was irrelevant, revised their thesis, and slimmed down the book. That's standard procedure in scholarly writing. It's something I had to do many times during the 30 years it took me to write work of human hands. But they couldn't bear to. So the authors left all the irrelevant research in their book. And they hoped sedevacantists wouldn't notice. Well, guess what? We did. Loss of office zombie still goes around looking for a confused brain to devour. If you're in the R&R camp, don't let it be yours.
A true pope? Oh, really?
So far, we've worked our way to the latter third of true or false pope. And we still have, it seems, about 170 pages to go. But don't start looking at your watch or step out for a break. The rest of this won't take very long.
What remains to consider are chapters 13 through 17 and chapter 20. Here, Messrs. Salza and Sicoe outline what sort of papacy and what sort of true pope they have saved from those wicked sedevacantists.
Once again, it's time for some discernment. Does the true pope of Messrs. Salza and Sicoe, for instance, get to decide what level of assent a Catholic must give to the teaching of an ecumenical council? Does the true pope of Messrs. Salza and Sicoe get to decide whether a papal or conciliar teaching is in conformity with tradition, or whether it is universal ordinary magisterium? No, wrong guy.
Right, guys.
A liturgical rite is harmful to souls, is covered by infallibility, or harmful to souls, is covered by infallibility, or is even validly promulgated? As they say in Brooklyn, forget about it. Of Messrs. Salza and Sicoe get to decide whether his canonizations are infallible or were done properly? Saints preserve us, no.
And drop their Paul-resisting Peter Dog and Pony show and actually obey? Checking Peter Dog and Pony show and actually obey? Check back after another 5 more Peters and another 50 years.
After your epic fail on internal heresy and your 250-page zombie argument, gentlemen, what kind of true pope does your book save for Catholics?
Pope with supreme authority to teach, rule, and sanctify, like this one? This one. Vestibule of your local trad chapel and nothing more? That is just fine with him. Bergoglio is the culmination of a 50-year revolution against the papacy and its authority. And you, my R&R friends, have been a part of it. He's been speeding up the process ever since he stepped out onto the balcony. Mothballing papal titles, raucous synods, spreading chaos, outsourcing morality, openly inviting criticism of himself, and generally encouraging us all to make a mess. He's a bomb thrower, and he's happy to make you part of his arsenal. 45 years of the Society of St. Pius X, recognize and resist, and countless lay apologists like you, gentlemen, does that leave Catholic teaching on a true pope? About 6 weeks ago, I posted the video Dead on Arrival, my analysis of John Salza and Robert Sicoe's 700-page anti-sedevacantist tirade, True or False Pope. Despite its length, the video has gotten 5,300 views to date and has generated a lot of buzz on discussion boards and social media. Filled with zeal to defend the status of this man, Jorge Bergoglio, as a true and legitimate successor of St. Peter and the Vicar of Christ on earth, produced a two-part, 25,000-word response. This, mind you, just as the remnant put out a book called We Accuse Pope Francis, and after a group of mainline conservative Novus Ordo theologians put out a study censuring various propositions in Bergoglio's Amoris Laetitia as heretical, dangerous, contrary to Scripture, and scandalous. Messrs. Salza and Sicoe's time would have perhaps been better spent arranging a dignified burial for their argument, perhaps along the line of this video's title photos, with the fraternal help of some old friends. Be that as it may, we can't resist offering a short but frank eulogy of our own as part of the send-off. In the response, Messrs. Salza and Sicoe's first goal was to cover up the fact that they, 1, falsely attributed my argument for the vacancy of the Holy See to a pope's internal sin of heresy, and 2, did so because they could not get straight the basic distinctions that moral theologians laid down for the sin of heresy, thus rendering their whole argument dead on arrival. Their defense was to claim that, while they had indeed used the term internal heresy, and this over 70 times throughout the course of their book, they really, truly meant to use the correct term, occult heresy, which we would know by diligently comparing Chapter 3 of True or False Pope with Chapter 5 of True or False Pope. Right. Google translates Salzaese to moral theologianese function as well. Or maybe the Rosetta Stone. That might have helped us. Well, Messrs. Salza and Sicoe, of course, insist that Father Cekada absolutely cannot claim that the Vatican II popes have committed the public sin of heresy. But at the end of the same article, they have no hesitation whatsoever in saying that Father Cekada is a public heretic. Funny. No one gave me any warnings to establish my public pertinacity, which Messrs. Salza and Sicoe would require for the Vatican II popes, and the Church certainly didn't issue a judgment. Or were Messrs. Salza and Sicoe granted jurisdiction by their Holy Father to issue a public judgment? The response. Messrs. Salza and Sicoe attempt to refute the sedevacantist argument that, due to public heresy, the Vatican II popes could not have been true popes in the first place. The sedevacantist argument here is based on canonists such as Wernz Vidal, Coronata, Badius, Cocci, and Sipos, who teach that as a matter of divine law, certain classes of people cannot be validly elected pope. These include the unbaptized, women, those under the age of reason, the habitually insane, and public schismatics and heretics. We've quoted these canonists in previous articles and videos, so we need not do so here again. In their latest article, Messrs. Salza and Sicoe do not even attempt to address the specific principles these canonists lay down. try a more general end run around them by saying, well, the universal peaceful or pacific recognition by the whole Church of someone as Pope shows he meets all the requirements.
Universal pacific recognition, they claim, establishes the papacy of a Vatican II Pope as a dogmatic fact, and it is therefore infallibly certain that the person chosen is the Pope. Sedevacantists are therefore schismatics, Father Cekada is guilty of mortal sin, etc., etc., etc. We've seen this argument and answered it before, as a check of my Salsa Cisco file from the previous film reveals. Cycling, which shows that they're at least obeying their Holy Father on something. First, hypocritical and contradictory. Theologians classify contradictory. Theologians classify dogmatic facts, together with the Church's universal disciplinary laws and canonizations, as secondary objects of infallibility. Messrs. Salza and Sicoe say of this general principle that, quote, the Church has never definitively taught this, much less clarified to what extent infallible protection would be guaranteed, unquote. So the infallibility of dogmatic facts is suddenly not really so ironclad after all. What's going on here? It's this. In chapters 15 and 16 of their book, Salza and Sicoe were trying to maneuver around the sedevacantist argument that the new Mass is a universal disciplinary law and is evil, which it could not have been if Paul VI had been a true pope. A true pope's universal disciplinary law has secondary objects of infallibility. They also needed to do so because in chapter 17 they sought to dismiss as invalid certain post-Vatican II canonizations that SSPX rejects, those of the founder of Opus Dei, Escriva, and of John XXIII and John Paul II. Also in Sicoe, then, secondary objects of infallibility are infallible for dogmatic facts, or are not infallible for universal disciplinary laws and canonizations, depending on which position works against sedevacantists and in favor of the SSPX party line. To support their contention that a public heretic can be validly elected a true pope, thanks to universal peaceful recognition by the entire Church, Messrs. Salza and Sicoe quote large chunks from the writings of the Dominican theologian John of St. Thomas. But appealing to John of St. Thomas on universal peaceful recognition to validate the election of a heretic as pope is the one thing that Messrs. Salza and Sicoe cannot do. This is because a papal law in force at the time he was writing, cum ex apostolatus officio of Paul IV, rendered such an election invalid, even with the unanimous consent of the cardinals and the obedience accorded the heretic pope by all. A dispute whether or not cum ex apostolatus still applies now. There is no question that it was in force when John of St. Thomas was writing. So for the purpose of legitimizing a heretical pope, his comments on universal recognition must be treated as moot. That the Vatican II popes were true popes because of universal pacific recognition by the whole Church,
Messrs. Salza and Sicoe quote the eminent 20th century theologian Louis Cardinal Biot. Adherents of the universal church, says Biot, would be, always and by itself, an infallible sign of the legitimacy of the person of the pontiff. Otherwise, he explains, the gates of hell would prevail, and the promise of Christ to be with his church all days would not be fulfilled. As to why this is so, beside the reality of how all traditionalists actually treated Paul VI and his successors, you not only defeat the Salza-Sicoe SSPX argument against sedevacantism, you also demonstrate that the whole lot of them are in reality sedevacantists themselves. This is so because Biot teaches that the whole church must necessarily, 1. Adhere to a true pope as the living rule of faith, and 2. Obey him. For it would be the same thing for the church to adhere to a false pope as it would be to adhere to a false rule of faith, since the pope is the living rule which the church must follow in believing, and always, in fact, follows. Conversely, it follows that if the church rejects a putative pope as the living rule of faith, it is likewise necessarily rejecting him as a true Roman pontiff, since his legitimacy and his status as the living rule of faith are two things which are essentially bound together. You can't have one without the other. The beginning of the resistance to the changes in the 1960s instinctively rejected the teachings of Vatican II and Paul VI as non-Catholic. In so doing, they ceased to regard Paul VI as the living rule of faith, and thus implicitly but necessarily rejected his status as a true pope as well. Traditionalists in those early days may not have had a unified or coherent explanation for how all this could have come about. Ensine, I remember hearing, was a Marrano, a Mason, a Satanist, a communist infiltrator, the Antichrist, a modernist, a secret apostate, an anti-apostle, etc. But traditionalists agreed on at least one thing. They absolutely rejected Paul VI's teachings as non-Catholic. Biot called the living rule which the church must follow in believing, and always in fact follows. In this respect, it was amusing to find Messrs. Salza and Sicoe attempting to shore up their case for universal recognition of Paul VI by quoting theologian Father Francis Connell's 1965. What certainty have we that the reigning pontiff is actually the primate of the universal church? That is, that he became a member of the church through valid baptism, and that he was validly elected pope? My reaction is, well, isn't it obvious from the mere fact that this question was asked in 1965, during the early days of Montini's putative reign, that some Catholics were challenging the validity of his election? Someone was worried enough to ask a question about it, and a prominent theologian thought it was important enough to answer in a theological journal. In any event, as the pernicious nature of the Vatican II changes became more widely recognized over the years, more and more Catholics came to reject Paul VI and his successors as the living rule of faith. When and how did the Society of St. Pius X and its founder, Archbishop Lefebvre, for instance, adhere to the teachings of the Vatican II popes as the living rule of faith to follow in believing? Was it when Archbishop Lefebvre said, "The current pope and bishops no longer hand down our Lord Jesus Christ"? and that this new religion is not the Catholic religion? Or was it when he said, to whatever extent Pope, bishops, priests, or faithful adhere to this new church, they separate themselves from the Catholic Church? Predecessors, they are no longer in the Catholic Church. Now reached everywhere, is spreading errors contrary to the Catholic faith. This false church is in an ever deeper state of rupture with the Catholic Church. Mocked the catechism that John Paul II promulgated, and had declared a statement of the Church's faith in Catholic doctrine and a sure norm for teaching the faith, by openly referring to it as the Catechism, has lost the faith, my dear friends. Rome is in apostasy, my dear friends. Rome is in apostasy. These are not words in the air. It is truth. Rome is in apostasy. They have left the church. This is sure, sure, sure. Are these the words of a man and an organization that recognize the legitimacy of Paul VI and his successors as the living rule which the church must follow in believing, and always in fact follows? And isn't this refusal the same arrangement Bishop Fillet seeks to perpetuate even now with Francis? To obtain his approval for SSPX as a personal prelature, while reserving the right to ignore and even to publicly criticize his doctrinal pronouncements? That confirms a pope's legitimacy. On this point, Cardinal Biot treats the case of Pope Alexander VI, whom the Dominican friar Savonarola accused of heresy. Biot says the proof Alexander VI was not a false pope, but a legitimate one, is found in the fact that, quote, all Christianity adhered to Alexander and obeyed him as a true pontiff. Which traditionalists in the R&R, Remnant, Catholic Family News, Salza-Sicoe orbit ever truly did that? And especially, when did Archbishop Lefebvre and his society ever do that? When he repeatedly refused orders from Paul VI to close down his seminary and to cease ordinations? When he conferred episcopal consecrations in the face of threats from John Paul II? As though the post-Vatican II popes did not exist? Is one of refusing to obey the post-conciliar popes as true pontiffs. Satan's masterstroke, he famously said, was to sow disobedience through obedience. In contrast, what weight or value should we assign to the recognition accorded the Vatican II popes by the vast majority of those who still called themselves Catholics, but in fact adhered to a new religion? To recognition, for instance, from the heretical modernist theologians who crafted the poisonous conciliar texts in order to subvert Catholic doctrine? Or from the modernist prelates who elected Roncalli and Montini, and at every turn approved, advanced, and implemented the revolutionary program of Vatican II? All these adhered to their fellow modernists, John XXIII, Paul VI, and their successors, as the living rule of faith, which the Church must follow in believing, and obeyed them as true Roman pontiffs. What value should we assign to the recognition of the Vatican II popes by the 90% of lay Catholics who would accept and then advance the modernist revolution in doctrine, worship, and morals? But would the arch-anti-modernist Cardinal Biot say we should regard recognition from creatures like these as the adherents of the universal church and as an infallible sign of legitimacy for such putative popes? The very opposite, that the adherents of the vast modernist horde to the conciliar popes and the rejection of their teachings and authority by faithful Catholics is proof of the conciliar popes' illegitimacy. In terms of both reasons that Biot gives for the Church's recognition of a pope as an infallible sign of legitimacy, therefore, the actions of faithful Catholics who repudiated and continue to repudiate the Vatican II religion are likewise a repudiation of the legitimacy of the Vatican II popes. Obviously, this is true of sedevacantists, but it is true of all traditionalists as well. The adepts of the recognize and resist may indeed protest loud and long that they recognize the Vatican II popes as true legitimate successors of Peter. Their actions attest to the opposite, and indeed turn Biot's principle of universal peaceful recognition around on them. Action of the conciliar popes in practice as a living rule of faith and as the supreme authority to be obeyed is a damning judgment against the legitimacy of the conciliar pontificates. SSPXers and R&R followers in reality are, and always have been, sedevacantists. It's just that they haven't admitted it yet. Depending on where you stand in the traditionalist movement, that will be either good news or bad news. But in any case, we sedevacantists have maintained for decades that the post-Vatican II popes cannot be true popes because of public heresy. Part of the proof is that the Vatican II popes have promulgated universal disciplinary laws that are evil, that harm faith or morals. Examples: the new Mass, the new Code of Canon Law. The Recognize and Resist, or R&R wing, of the traditionalist movement tries to defeat these arguments by accusing various pre-Vatican II popes of heresy, or by maintaining that the Church can give evil in her universal disciplinary laws. Thus they recycle charges of doctrinal error, or heresy, against Popes Nicholas I, Vigilius, Honorius, Liberius, John XXII, or Alexander VI. Protestants, and others who rejected papal infallibility, made the same accusations, of course, and all the charges have been repeatedly refuted by Catholic dogmatic theologians. But like Charlie Brown with the football, the R&R folks never seem to learn that their mission is futile. Courtesy of Robert Sicoe, co-author of the anti-sedevacantist screed True or False Sicoe, co-author of the anti-sedevacantist screed True or False Pope. Writing in The Remnant, Mr. Sicoe claims that in one of his decrees in a matrimonial case, Celestine III taught a doctrinal error concerning the indissolubility of sacramental marriage, and 2, Pope Gregory IX incorporated the error into the Church's universal disciplinary laws. It related to what is called the Pauline privilege. Our interest, rather, is in Mr. Sicoe's attempt to transform Celestine's decree into a universal disciplinary law. He thinks he's launched a ballistic missile that will obliterate sedevacantism. But a quick check of commentaries by canon law experts such as Nas, Capello, and Cicognani shows that Mr. Sicoe's shoddy scholarship has caused his arguments to, shall we say, misfire? With the text from St. Robert Bellarmine. Mr. Sicoe portrays the writings of another theologian, Alfonso de Castro, as Bellarmine's own commentary on the case of Pope Celestine. But in fact, Bellarmine was merely summing up de Castro's position as an objection in order to refute it. This is obvious because Bellarmine immediately follows the passage Mr. Sicoe quotes with the word respondeo, I respond, and starts another paragraph. So, Mr. Sicoe has committed a flub here, akin to that of an ignorant first-year seminarian. Objection in the Summa Theologica for the actual position of St. Thomas Aquinas. But in any case, Bellarmine blows off de Castro's charge against Celestine, and with it that of Mr. Sicoe, by saying that at the time, the whole issue had still been a matter of opinion. A matter of opinion. So with nothing defined, theologians were still free to offer various opinions, which is just what Celestine implied by using the phrase non videtur nobis. It does not seem to us. Mr. Sicoe also claims that Celestine's error was incorporated into canon law through the promulgation of the decretals of Gregory IX in 1234, which thus gave it, he claims, full juridical value as a law text. With these grand declarations, Mr. Sicoe has really rolled into the quicksand. For starters, the compiler of the 1917 Code of Canon Law, Pietro Cardinal Gaspari, a rather authoritative source to say the least, said there was neither a trace nor a vestige of Celestine's decree in the decretals of Gregory IX. Well, where did it come from then? It is found in what is called the Second Compilation, a private collection of decrees assembled by John of Wales in 1210. This collection, says the canonist Cicognani, did not obtain public authority. It was nevertheless one of the many collections of church decrees that St. Raymond of Penafort drew upon to assemble the official collection that would be promulgated as the decretals of Gregory IX. But the text of Celestine, despite what Mr. Sicoe says, never made it. Cardinal Bio states flatly that it never became law. And he adds, Gregory IX even expressly commanded that it be excluded from the authentic collection of canons made by St. Raymond. Three, therefore, ended up among what the canonists call the partes decise, that is to say, those parts of the decretals that the compiler and the legislator left out or cut off. And the partes decise, says Cicognani, have no legal force or even historic value, accurately introduced, make such an idiotic error. Text in the 1959 Richter-Freeburg edition of the decretals. Voila, he thinks, the end of sedevacantism as we know it, lock and load. The text of Celestine's decree, however, unlike the text before and after it, is printed in italics rather than regular characters. He would have learned that italics signified that a portion of a text was one of the partes signified, that a portion of a text was one of the partes decise omitted from the text that Gregory finally promulgated. It was cut out, and along with it, another one of Mr. Sicoe's arguments. To sum up on the case of Pope Celestine, Mr. Sicoe committed a major blunder by presenting St. Robert Bellarmine's summary of an objection as Bellarmine's actual position, which was that Celestine was merely expressing what was considered a defensible theological opinion at the time. Mr. Sicoe's claim that Celestine's error was incorporated into canon law is false. It had no legal force, and Gregory IX expressly commanded that the passage, quote, be excluded from the authentic collection of canons. Mr. Sicoe could have found this out in 15 minutes, just as I did, by looking in a few canonical commentaries, or even just bothering to find out why the editor of his precious gotcha text printed it in italics. There are other errors in Mr. Sicoe's article, egregious, dishonest, and redolent of Protestantism, but these we will leave for a future video. Bigger picture, a recognize and resists decades-long campaign to destroy authentic Catholic teaching on the doctrinal and disciplinary authority of a true pope. Their pope, like this guy here, is still a cardboard pope. But for the moment, in the matter of the so-called error of Pope Celestine, we can enjoy the sight of yet another specious anti-sedevacantist argument going down in flames.